The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the quiet streets of Havenwood, a town that lived up to its name in the gentle rhythm of its days. Amongst the well-tended lawns and the comforting familiarity of neighborly greetings resided Michael O'Connell, a man who had long since embraced the unassuming cadence of civilian life. At 72 years of age, his once ramrod straight posture had softened with the years, and the sharp glint in his steely blue eyes had mellowed into a thoughtful gaze that often seemed to drift towards memories only he could access. Michael lived in a modest bungalow on Sycamore Lane, the small front garden a testament to his quiet dedication. Roses, his late wife Eleanor's favorite, bloomed in a riot of color, carefully pruned and tended with the same meticulousness he had once applied to his military duties. The inside of the house was just as orderly, each object in its place, a reflection of the discipline ingrained by decades of service. He was, to the casual observer, just another elderly gentleman enjoying his retirement in a peaceful corner of America. He took his morning walks to the local diner for coffee, exchanged pleasantries with the shopkeepers, and spent his afternoons reading on the porch swing or tending to his roses. Few in Havenwood knew the depth of experience that lay beneath his calm exterior, the weight of the rank he had once held, or the countless sacrifices he had made in service to his country. Sergeant Major, retired, Michael O'Connell was a title that existed now only on faded documents and in the recesses of his own memory. For 35 years, he had been the epitome of the steadfast soldier, a leader who commanded respect through his unwavering dedication, his encyclopedic knowledge of military procedure, and a quiet authority that never needed to be asserted loudly. He had seen action in more theaters than he cared to recall, his body bearing the silent testament of those years in the subtle aches that accompanied the changing weather. His unassuming nature extended to his interactions with the local authorities. He had always believed in respecting law and order, a principle deeply ingrained in his military ethos. His encounters with the Havenwood Police Department had been infrequent and generally unremarkable, consisting mostly of polite nods or brief exchanges about local happenings. However, a subtle undercurrent had begun to ripple through these interactions in recent months, a barely perceptible shift in the way a particular pair of officers regarded him. Officers Miller and Davies, young men barely out of their 20s, seemed to possess a certain swagger, a confidence that occasionally bordered on arrogance. They often patrolled his neighborhood, their patrol car a familiar sight on Sycamore Lane. Their initial interactions with Michael had been innocuous enough. A casual question about a suspicious vehicle parked down the street, a friendly reminder about local parking regulations. But there had been a subtle condescension in their tone, a way of addressing him that felt dismissive, as if his age automatically relegated him to a position of lesser importance. One sunny afternoon, as Michael was carefully pruning his roses, Officers Miller and Davies pulled up to the curb, their patrol car idling loudly. Michael straightened up, wiping his gloved hands on his trousers, a polite but questioning look on his face. "Everything all right, officers?" he asked, his voice calm and steady. Officer Miller, a stocky young man with a cocky grin, leaned out of the driver's side window. "Just checking things out, Mr. O'Connell. You know how it is. Gotta keep an eye on things in this quiet little town." His tone held a hint of sarcasm that Michael didn't miss. Officer Davies, younger and more reserved, simply nodded in acknowledgement from the passenger seat. Michael, choosing to ignore the slight, simply nodded back. "Of course. Appreciate you keeping us safe." He turned back to his roses, intending to resume his work. "Say, Mr. O'Connell," Miller called out, his voice laced with a playful yet subtly mocking tone. "You ever get bored around here? Nothing much happens in Havenwood, does it?" Michael paused, clipping another rose. He straightened up again, his gaze meeting Miller's directly. "I find plenty to occupy my time, officer." His voice remained even, betraying none of the mild irritation he felt. Miller chuckled, exchanging a knowing glance with Davies. Yeah, I bet. All those memories to keep you company, huh? The implication hung in the air, a dismissive reference to Michael's age and perceived irrelevance. Michael's blue eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of the old steel returning to his gaze. He held Miller's gaze for a moment longer than necessary, a silent message passing between them that the young officer likely didn't fully comprehend. Then, Michael simply nodded curtly and returned to his roses, deliberately turning his back on the patrol car. Miller laughed again, a short, dismissive sound, before he put the car in gear and pulled away from the curb, Davies offering a quick, almost apologetic glance in Michael's direction before they drove off. The interaction was brief, seemingly insignificant. But for Michael O'Connell, it left a faint but lingering taste of disrespect, a subtle prick to the pride of a man who had once commanded the unwavering obedience of thousands. It was a small cloud on the otherwise peaceful horizon of his retirement, a hint of a potential storm brewing in the seemingly placid atmosphere of Havenwood. The quiet rhythm of Michael O'Connell's days resumed after the brief, unsettling exchange with Officers Miller and Davies. He tried to dismiss the encounter as the overzealousness of youth, a fleeting moment of misplaced superiority. He returned to his roses, the familiar scent of the blooms and the gentle prick of the thorns, a comforting anchor in his routine. The sun continued its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, and the peace of Havenwood settled back into its customary embrace. A few days later, however, the unease stirred by the young officers returned, this time with a sharper edge. Michael had driven into town to pick up groceries, a simple errand he had performed countless times without incident. He parked his aging but well-maintained sedan in a spot just outside the local supermarket, carefully noting the parking regulations displayed on a nearby sign. He was meticulous about such things, a habit ingrained by years of military discipline where attention to detail could mean the difference between success and failure, even life and death. He emerged from the supermarket, a bag of groceries in each hand, and was about to unlock his car when he heard the familiar sound of a patrol car pulling up behind him. He turned to see Officers Miller and Davies emerging from their vehicle, their expressions less casual this time, carrying a certain air of purposeful confrontation. "Mr. O'Connell," Officer Miller said, his voice carrying a more assertive tone than before. "We need to have a word with you." Michael lowered his groceries slightly, a sense of weary resignation washing over him. He had hoped the previous encounter had been an isolated incident, but their deliberate approach suggested otherwise. "Is there a problem, officers?" he asked, his voice calm but with a hint of caution. Officer Davies stepped forward, pointing towards the front of Michael's car. "You're parked illegally, sir. That's a no parking zone." Michael frowned, his gaze shifting to the parking sign he had specifically checked. "That sign indicates 2-hour parking between 9 and 5, officers. It's well within those hours, and I haven't been here for more than 15 minutes." He spoke calmly, stating the facts as he understood them. Miller scoffed, folding his arms across his chest. "Well, you're obstructing the fire hydrant, old-timer. Can't you see the yellow line on the curb?" Michael's eyes followed Miller's pointed gesture. He had indeed parked a few inches over the faded yellow line marking the designated clearance zone around the fire hydrant. It was an oversight, a minor error in judgment. He was usually more careful. "You're right, officer," Michael conceded, his tone even. "My apologies, I didn't notice. I'll move the car immediately." He reached for his keys, intending to rectify his mistake. "Hold on a second," Miller interjected, his tone now laced with a distinct sense of superiority. "It's not just about moving the car, Mr. O'Connell. You've been warned before about these kinds of infractions." Michael's brow furrowed in confusion. "Warned before, officer? I don't recall any previous warnings about parking." "Don't you?" Miller challenged, stepping closer. Maybe your memory isn't what it used to be, old man. You've got to be more careful. There are rules for a reason. His words carried a condescending edge that grated on Michael's nerves. Officer Davies stood silently by, observing the interaction with a detached expression. Michael's military training had taught him the value of maintaining composure, especially when dealing with individuals in positions of authority. He took a deep breath. Sorry curd to keep his voice level. Officer, I made a simple mistake. I've acknowledged it and offered to correct it. I don't believe a warning, let alone an accusation of repeated offenses, is necessary. Miller smirked, a look of smug satisfaction spreading across his face. Well, that's for us to decide, isn't it, Mr. O'Connell? We're the ones upholding the law in Havenwood. He paused, his gaze sweeping over Michael's aging frame. Maybe it's time for some folks to consider whether they should still be driving at all. That remark, aimed directly at his age and implying a loss of competence, hit a raw nerve. Michael had always prided himself on his independence and his ability to care for himself. The insinuation that he was no longer capable stung deeply. He met Miller's gaze, the blue in his eyes hardening. My driving record is impeccable, officer. And I assure you, I am perfectly capable of operating a motor vehicle safely. His voice, though still controlled, carried a firm undertone that hinted at the authority he once commanded. Miller simply laughed, shaking his head dismissively. Whatever you say, Mr. O'Connell. Just move the car and try to pay more attention next time. We don't want any accidents happening on our watch. He stepped back, gesturing towards Michael's vehicle with a condescending wave of his hand. Michael, his jaw tight, unlocked his car and carefully maneuvered it into a legal parking spot a few spaces down. The entire exchange had taken less than 10 minutes, but the lingering feeling of disrespect and the deliberate attempt to demean him left a bitter taste in his mouth. It wasn't just about the parking. It was about the officer's attitude, the way they had spoken to him, the clear lack of respect for his age and his person. As he gathered his groceries, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a minor misunderstanding. There was something personal in their demeanor, a subtle antagonism that he couldn't quite decipher, but knew, with a growing certainty, that it was not over. Michael O'Connell found himself increasingly wary of the familiar sight of the Havenwood Police Department patrol car on the streets of his quiet town. The encounters with Officers Miller and Davies had left an unpleasant residue, a sense of simmering resentment that disturbed the peaceful equilibrium of his retirement. He had always held the local police force in a degree of respect, viewing them as fellow guardians of the community. But the behavior of these two young officers had begun to erode that trust. He made a conscious effort to avoid any situations that might lead to another interaction, altering his usual walking routes and being extra careful to adhere to all traffic laws. He even started having his groceries delivered, a small concession to the unwelcome anxiety that now accompanied his trips into town. He found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, a habit long dormant since his military days. One crisp autumn afternoon, however, an unavoidable encounter occurred. Michael was tending to the roses in his front garden, the late-season blooms providing a final burst of color before the onset of winter. He was humming softly to himself, lost in the familiar rhythm of pruning and deadheading, when the sound of a car horn startled him. He looked up to see the Havenwood patrol car slowing to a stop at the curb in front of his house. Officers Miller and Davies were inside, Miller behind the wheel. Michael sighed inwardly, a sense of weariness settling over him. He straightened up, trowel in hand, waiting to see what they wanted this time. Miller leaned out of the window, a smirk playing on his lips. "Looking busy there, Mr. O'Connell." His tone was laced with a familiarity that felt intrusive, a mockery of neighborly politeness. Michael simply nodded, offering a curt, officer in return. He made no move to engage in further conversation, hoping they would simply drive on. But Miller seemed determined to provoke him. "You know, we were just saying the other day, this town's getting a bit overgrown, wouldn't you say? Needs a bit of tidying up." He gestured vaguely towards Michael's meticulously cared-for garden. Michael's grip tightened on the trowel. "I believe my garden is well maintained, officer." His voice was calm, but carried a hint of warning. Davies chuckled from the passenger seat. "Maybe he means you need to tidy yourself up, old-timer." He leaned forward, peering at Michael with a condescending grin. "Looking a little rough around the edges these days, aren't we?" The insult, though veiled in a thin layer of jest, landed squarely. Michael, despite his age, took pride in his appearance. He kept himself fit with daily walks and maintained a neat and tidy appearance. The implication that he was somehow decrepit and unkempt stung. Michael's blue eyes narrowed, the years of military discipline preventing any outward display of anger. "My appearance is of no concern to you, officers." Miller chuckled again, a short, dismissive sound. Sure. Just a friendly observation, Mr. O'Connell. Wouldn't want the neighborhood looking bad because of certain residents." He let the implication hang in the air, the veiled jab at Michael's age and perceived social standing clear. At this point, Michael's patience began to fray. The deliberate disrespect, the casual insults aimed at his age and his home, felt like a calculated attempt to demean and provoke him. He had endured far worse in his military career. But the casual cruelty of these young officers in his own peaceful front garden was particularly galling. "Is there an actual reason you've stopped here, officers?" Michael asked, his voice losing its earlier calm. "Or are you simply here to offer your unsolicited opinions on my gardening and personal grooming?" Miller's smirk widened. "Feisty, aren't we? Didn't think you still had that much fight in you, Mr. O'Connell." He leaned back in his seat, his gaze challenging. "Maybe we should get out and have a little chat, man to man." The thinly veiled threat hung in the air. Michael, despite his age, was still a physically imposing man. Years of military training had left him with a strength and resilience that belied his 72 years. He could handle himself if it came to it. But the thought of a physical altercation with these young officers on his own property was deeply distasteful. He took a deep breath, sigh occurred to keep the situation from escalating. "I see no need for that, officer. I am simply tending my garden on my own property. I have broken no laws." Davies suddenly stepped out of the patrol car, stretching theatrically. "Just making sure everything's all right here, Mike." He used Michael's first name with a sickeningly sweet tone that felt deliberately condescending. He started to walk towards Michael, a slight swagger in his step. Michael stood his ground, the trowel held loosely but firmly in his hand. His military pride, the deep-seated sense of dignity he had carried for decades, bristled at the officer's blatant disrespect and intimidation. He would not be bullied in his own home, not after all he had endured in service to his country. He held Davies' gaze, a silent warning in his steely blue eyes. The quiet citizen was beginning to remember the soldier within. The palpable tension in the air of Havenwood seemed to recede as Officers Miller and Davies, having failed to elicit the reaction they seemingly desired from Michael O'Connell, finally returned to their patrol car and drove away. Michael watched them go, his gaze unwavering, the weight of their disrespect settling heavy in his chest. It wasn't the insults themselves, nor even the veiled threat that truly bothered him. It was the casual dismissal of his service, the complete lack of regard for the uniform he had worn with pride for so many years, the sacrifices he had made for the very freedoms these young officers now took for granted. He returned to his roses, but the familiar solace of the garden had been tainted. The vibrant colors of the blooms seemed less cheerful, the gentle breeze rustling through the leaves, carrying a hint of the officer's mocking laughter. He found himself unable to focus, his thoughts replaying the encounter, the casual disrespect, a persistent irritant. Finally, with a sigh of joie, Michael put down his trowel and headed inside. The cool air of the bungalow offered a welcome contrast to the lingering heat of the afternoon. He walked through this meticulously ordered living room to his study, a small room lined with bookshelves filled with well-worn volumes on military history and strategy. On a small oak desk sat an old-fashioned rotary phone, a relic from a time when communication was less instant, but perhaps more deliberate. Michael sat down heavily in his worn leather chair, the familiar creak a comforting sound. He reached for the phone, his calloused fingers dialing a number he knew by heart, a number that hadn't changed in decades. Each rotation of the dial was a deliberate act, a turning back to a world he had long since left behind, but one that still held a powerful connection to the core of his being. The phone rang 3 times before it was answered by a crisp, professional voice. "General's office, Sergeant Major Hayes speaking." The voice was familiar, tinged with a hint of the same disciplined authority that Michael himself once projected. "Hayes, it's O'Connell," Michael said, his own voice firm despite his age. The simple utterance of his name carried a weight that needed no further explanation. There was a brief pause on the other end, a moment of surprised recognition. "Sergeant Major O'Connell? Sir, it's an honor. We haven't heard from you in... well, it's been a while." There was a genuine warmth in Hayes's tone, a clear indication of the respect Michael commanded, even in retirement. "Hayes, I need a favor," Michael said, cutting straight to the point, his military efficiency still ingrained. There was no room for pleasantries when duty called. "Anything, Sergeant Major. You know that." Hayes's response was immediate and unwavering, a testament to the deep loyalty Michael had earned over his years of service. "I've had a disagreement with the local police here in Havenwood," Michael explained, his tone understated, omitting the details of the petty harassment he had endured. He knew Hayes would understand the gravity of the situation simply by the fact that he was making this call. "Understood, Sergeant Major. What do you need?" Hayes's voice was now all business, the years of military training kicking in. "I need you to make a call," Michael said, his voice firm. He then gave Hayes a brief but precise set of instructions, outlining exactly what he needed done and the time frame in which he expected it to happen. His words were measured, each one carrying the weight of command. Hayes listened intently, his responses brief and affirmative. "Yes, Sergeant Major." "Understood, sir. We'll take care of it immediately." There was no hesitation, no questioning of the request. For Sergeant Major Hayes, a command from Michael O'Connell was still in order to be executed without delay. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. When Michael hung up the phone, a sense of quiet resolve settled over him. He had set the wheels in motion, and he knew, with absolute certainty, that the response would be swift and decisive. He had called upon a world he had left behind, but it was a world that still answered to his name. The disrespect he had endured would not go unanswered. The pride of an old soldier, though wounded, was far from broken. The brief phone call placed from Michael O'Connell's quiet study reverberated through the upper echelons of the United States Army with the speed and precision of a well-oiled machine. Sergeant Major Hayes, a man whose own distinguished career had been profoundly shaped by the mentorship and unwavering standards of Michael O'Connell, did not hesitate for a moment. The respect and loyalty he held for his former commander transcended the boundaries of retirement. An order from O'Connell was still an order to be executed swiftly and without question. Immediately after hanging up the rotary phone in his meticulously organized office at the Pentagon, Hayes's hand reached for his secure line. The call was placed to General Thompson, the current Chief of Staff of the Army, a man whose rise through the ranks had been closely observed and occasionally guided by the steady hand of Sergeant Major O'Connell during his active service. The general answered on the second ring, his voice crisp and alert. "General Thompson speaking." "Sir, Sergeant Major Hayes here. I have just received a direct communication from Sergeant Major, retired, O'Connell." Hayes's tone was formal, imbued with the gravity of the message he was about to deliver. A momentary pause could be detected on the other end. General Thompson held O'Connell in the highest regard, a legendary figure whose name still echoed through the corridors of power within the military. "O'Connell, what is it, Hayes?" The general's voice held a note of immediate attention. Hayes relayed the essence of his conversation with O'Connell, the details concise and to the point, emphasizing the request and the urgency conveyed by the retired sergeant major. He carefully avoided speculation or personal opinions, sticking strictly to the information he had received. General Thompson listened intently, his brow furrowed in thought. The fact that O'Connell had made this call indicated a situation of significant concern. The old sergeant major was not one to trouble the chain of command lightly. "Understood, Hayes. I will take immediate action." Within minutes, General Thompson was on another secure line, this time speaking with the commander of the local military installation nearest to Havenwood, a sprawling base that housed a significant number of active duty personnel and equipment. The general's instructions were direct and unequivocal, leaving no room for misinterpretation. He conveyed the urgency of the situation, the direct involvement of Sergeant Major O'Connell, and the need for an immediate and substantial response. The order cascaded down through the ranks with remarkable speed. Duty officers alerted commanding officers, who in turn issued directives to their respective units. The quiet hum of the military installation sprang to life, the rhythmic cadence of routine operations replaced by a palpable sense of urgency. Personnel were recalled from leave, equipment was checked and prepared, and deployment orders were rapidly processed. In the barracks, the atmosphere shifted from the usual daytime lull to a flurry of focused activity. Soldiers moved with practiced efficiency, their years of training kicking in instinctively. Gear was swiftly gathered, vehicles were started, and formations began to take shape. The unspoken understanding was clear. An order had come from the top, and the response needed to be immediate and decisive. At the motor pool, mechanics worked with focused intensity, ensuring every vehicle was ready for deployment. Humvees roared to life, their powerful engines shattering the morning calm. Trucks loaded with equipment were swiftly organized into convoys, ready to roll out at a moment's notice. In the command center, maps were unfurled, routes were planned, and communication lines were secured. High-ranking officers, their faces grim and determined, oversaw the rapid mobilization, their every action driven by the authority of the orders they had received. The name of Sergeant Major O'Connell was whispered with a mixture of respect and perhaps a hint of apprehension. They knew that if the old Sergeant Major was involved, the situation was likely more serious than it initially appeared. The immediate and unquestioning response was a testament to the deep respect and unwavering loyalty that Michael O'Connell had cultivated throughout his distinguished military career. His leadership had been characterized by integrity, fairness, and an unwavering commitment to the well-being of his troops. He had earned the trust and admiration of generations of soldiers, and even in retirement, his word carried immense weight within the military community. The call had been made, and the Army, his Army, was answering. The wheels of a significant military operation had been set in motion, all stemming from a brief conversation initiated by a quiet citizen in a peaceful little town. Across the sprawling landscape of the military installation closest to Havenwood, a transformation was underway. The quiet hum of daily routines had been abruptly replaced by a frenetic surge of activity, a palpable energy thrumming through the very foundations of the base. Barracks lights blazed well past the usual hour, the sounds of hurried footsteps and clipped commands echoing through the corridors. In the vehicle depots, the air was thick with the smell of diesel and the clang of tools. Mechanics worked with a focused intensity, their movements precise and efficient as they conducted rapid inspections and topped off fluids in a vast array of military vehicles. Humvees, their rugged frames casting imposing shadows under the harsh floodlights, were prepped for deployment, their onboard communication systems checked and double-checked. Troop transports, their cavernous interiors soon to be filled with eager soldiers, were lined up in neat rows, ready to roll out at a moment's notice. Within the armory, the usual order and quiet were disrupted by the sounds of weapons being inspected and secured. Soldiers, their faces a mixture of anticipation and grim determination, methodically checked their gear, ensuring every piece of equipment was in perfect working order. There was a shared sense of purpose in their actions, an unspoken understanding that an important mission lay ahead. Briefing rooms, usually reserved for scheduled exercises and strategic planning sessions, became hubs of urgent activity. Officers, their ranks denoted by the insignia on their uniforms, huddled over maps spread across large tables, their fingers tracing routes and marking key locations. The air was filled with the murmur of hushed conversations as they coordinated deployment strategies and reviewed the limited information available regarding the situation in Havenwood. The mobilization wasn't confined to the ground. At the base's airfield, the roar of turbine engines shattered the stillness of the late afternoon. Helicopters, their rotors kicking up swirling gusts of dust and debris, were prepped for immediate takeoff. Pilots and crew chiefs conducted rapid pre-flight checks, their movements sharp and decisive. The silhouettes of transport planes loomed large against the darkening sky, their cargo bays standing ready to swallow vehicles and personnel for swift deployment. The speed and efficiency of the mobilization were a direct reflection of years of rigorous training and ingrained protocols. Every soldier, every airman, every sailor on the base understood their role in the complex machinery of military response. The call had come down the chain of command, and their training had taken over, transforming individuals into a cohesive and formidable force ready to act with unwavering precision. There was a sense of urgency, but not panic. The soldiers moved with a focused determination, their actions driven by duty and a deep-seated understanding of their responsibilities. The authority conveyed in the initial orders, the subtle emphasis on the involvement of Sergeant Major O'Connell, instilled a sense of gravity in the operation. They knew this wasn't a routine exercise. Something significant was unfolding in the quiet town of Havenwood. The overwhelming force being assembled was a testament to the respect and influence that Michael O'Connell still commanded within the military. His name, though rarely spoken in everyday conversation, carried a weight of authority that transcended rank. Generations of soldiers had been trained and mentored under his guidance, and the loyalty he had earned over decades of selfless service still resonated deeply within the ranks. The Army was not just responding to an order. It was answering the silent call of one of its most respected leaders, a man who had dedicated his life to their service and now found himself in need. The machinery of the military, vast and powerful, was now fully engaged, its sights set on the seemingly tranquil streets of Havenwood, a storm brewing beneath the surface of its quiet facade. The uncharacteristic commotion emanating from the direction of the highway began to stir the quiet afternoon in Havenwood. The rumble of heavy vehicles, a sound distinctly different from the usual local traffic, carried on the gentle breeze, reaching the ears of residents tending their gardens or enjoying a peaceful moment on their porches. A sense of mild curiosity, a ripple in the town's otherwise placid surface, started to spread. Old Mrs. Gable, known for her keen interest in local happenings and her extensive network of informal information, was the first on Sycamore Lane to notice the unusual activity. She had been watering her prize-winning petunias when the low growl of engines grew louder, accompanied by a rhythmic whirring sound she couldn't quite place. Peeking over her meticulously trimmed hedge, she saw a convoy of olive green trucks. Unlike anything she had ever seen pass through Havenwood, rumbling slowly but steadily towards the center of town. Intrigued, she hurried inside to call her neighbor, Martha, whose porch offered a slightly better vantage point. Martha, equally perplexed, had already received a call from her friend over on Elm Street, who had reported seeing similar vehicles heading in their direction. The whispers began to circulate, a low hum of speculation passing from neighbor to neighbor like an unseen current. Theories abounded, ranging from a National Guard exercise to some sort of emergency response from a neighboring county. The more imaginative residents even pondered the possibility of a movie being filmed in their typically sleepy town. No one, however, connected the unusual military presence to the quiet, unassuming elderly man who lived down on Sycamore Lane, tending his roses. Sergeant Major, retired, Michael O'Connell, remained an invisible thread in the unfolding events, his role yet to be perceived by the townsfolk. Downtown Havenwood, the usual afternoon tranquility was subtly disrupted. At the local diner, where conversations usually revolved around the weather and high school football scores, the topic shifted to the strange vehicles passing by on Main Street. Coffee cups paused mid-air as patrons peered out of the windows, their brows furrowed in confusion. Sheriff Brody, a man who had served Havenwood for over 20 years and prided himself on knowing every resident and every routine, felt a prickle of unease. He hadn't been informed of any planned military activity in the area. He picked up the phone to call the dispatch office, a knot of concern tightening in his stomach. His deputy reported multiple sightings of military vehicles heading towards the old town square. Brody's unease grew. This was far beyond a routine exercise. He tried reaching out to the state police barracks, but they too had no information regarding a large-scale military deployment in Havenwood. The local police department, a small force consisting of Brody, 2 deputies, and a handful of patrol officers, including Miller and Davies, remained blissfully unaware of the true nature of the unfolding events. Miller and Davies were on their usual afternoon patrol, their conversation light and punctuated by occasional bursts of laughter. They had encountered no unusual activity, just the typical quiet afternoon in Havenwood. The subtle unease spreading through the town hadn't yet reached their insulated bubble of routine patrols and small-town authority. They continued their rounds, oblivious to the fact that the very man they had chosen to disrespect was now the catalyst for an unprecedented event about to unfold in their seemingly peaceful community. The 30-minute time frame initiated by Michael O'Connell's phone call was rapidly approaching its culmination, and Havenwood was on the cusp of witnessing a display of force that would shatter its tranquil facade. The first tangible signs of the approaching military force began to materialize on the outskirts of Havenwood, disrupting the late afternoon calm with an undeniable sense of purpose. A convoy of 3 Humvees, their olive green paint stark against the backdrop of the autumnal foliage, rumbled off the main highway onto the quieter roads leading into town. These were the Vanguard, a reconnaissance element tasked with assessing the situation and securing key points ahead of the main deployment. Inside the lead vehicle, a young captain, his face serious and focused, consulted a digital map on a ruggedized tablet. His radio crackled intermittently with brief, coded messages from the larger unit following closely behind. He had been given minimal information, only that they were responding to a direct request from Sergeant Major, retired, O'Connell, a name that commanded immediate respect within their ranks. The details of the situation in Havenwood remained vague, adding to the air of focused anticipation within the small team. As the Humvees navigated the winding roads, The residents of Havenwood, who happened to be outdoors, paused in their activities, watching with a mixture of curiosity and mild apprehension. The sight of military vehicles was unusual enough, but the determined expressions on the faces of the soldiers and the purposeful way they moved suggested something beyond a routine exercise. Whispers grew louder, cell phones were produced, and snippets of conversation about the approaching military presence began to circulate more widely. The convoy moved swiftly through the town, the drivers adhering strictly to traffic laws but maintaining a steady pace. They passed by the local diner, where the earlier speculation about the military vehicles intensified as patrons pressed their faces against the windows, their conversations now hushed and filled with a sense of growing intrigue. They drove past the supermarket, where Michael O'Connell had experienced his unsettling encounter with Officers Miller and Davies just days before. The memory of that incident remained vivid in Michael's mind as he watched the news of the approaching military on his television, a quiet sense of anticipation building within him. The reconnaissance team made their way towards the old town square, a central location that offered a clear vantage point of the surrounding area. They parked their vehicles in a strategic formation, the soldiers quickly dismounting and taking up observation positions, their movements practiced and efficient. They scanned the surroundings, their eyes sharp and alert, taking in every detail of the seemingly peaceful town, searching for any signs of the situation that had prompted their deployment. Sheriff Brody, who had been growing increasingly concerned by the mounting reports of military vehicles, finally decided to take action. He radioed his deputies, instructing them to converge on the town square to assess the situation. He himself jumped into his patrol car, a knot of apprehension tightening in his chest. He still hadn't received any official notification of a military operation, and the scale of the deployment being described by residents was deeply Trevozhny. As Brody's patrol car approached the town square, he could see the olive-green Humvees parked in a precise formation, the soldiers standing jing-jiedi nearby. The sight sent a jolt of unease through him. This was more than just a few stray vehicles. This was a coordinated military presence. He slowed his approach, his hand instinctively reaching for his radio. Just as Brody was about to call in his position, he saw another patrol car pulling up to the square. Miller and Davies, on their usual afternoon rounds, their expressions shifting from their typical nonchalance to one of wide-eyed surprise as they took in the scene before them. The casual arrogance that usually characterized their demeanor seemed to falter, replaced by a dawning realization that something significant and beyond their control was unfolding in their quiet town. The vanguard had arrived, and the peaceful facade of Havenwood was about to be irrevocably shattered. The arrival of the Humvee reconnaissance team was merely a prelude to the overwhelming display of military might that was about to descend upon Havenwood. Within the next 15 minutes, the quiet hum of the afternoon was completely drowned out by the thunderous roar of a significant military convoy making its way into town. A seemingly endless procession of olive-green vehicles, their presence an undeniable statement of power, rolled off the highway and onto the unsuspecting streets. Troop transports, their canvas tops billowing slightly in the wind, carried scores of uniformed soldiers, their faces grim and focused. Armored personnel carriers, their heavy treads leaving imprints on the asphalt, followed closely behind, their mounted machine guns a stark reminder of their capabilities. Supply trucks, laden with equipment and provisions, stretched out the length of the convoy, ensuring the deployed forces were self-sufficient. The sheer scale of the military response was breathtaking. It was a mobilization far exceeding anything the residents of Havenwood could have imagined, transforming their peaceful community into what resembled a temporary military encampment. The rumble of engines echoed off the quaint storefronts. The presence of armed soldiers replaced the familiar faces of neighbors, and the air, once filled with the gentle sounds of suburban life, now vibrated with the low thrum of military power. The convoy moved with practiced precision, the vehicles maintaining strict formation as they navigated the town's main streets. They converged on the area around the old town square, the location identified by the reconnaissance team as the most strategic point. Soldiers disembarked from the transports with swift efficiency, their movements coordinated and purposeful. They established perimeters, secured key intersections, and took up tactical positions with a speed and expertise honed by years of rigorous training. Sheriff Brody watched the unfolding scene with a growing sense of disbelief and alarm. The arrival of a small reconnaissance team had been unsettling enough, but the sheer volume of military personnel and equipment now flooding his town was beyond comprehension. He had tried repeatedly to contact state and federal authorities, but information remained scarce, adding to his mounting frustration and anxiety. He felt a profound sense of being out of control, his authority as the town's sheriff seemingly dwarfed by the overwhelming military presence. Officers Miller and Davies, who had initially approached the town square with a mixture of curiosity and concern, were now frozen in place, their patrol car parked haphazardly on the side of the road. The casual arrogance that had defined their interactions with Michael O'Connell had completely evaporated, replaced by expressions of wide-eyed shock and a dawning realization of the magnitude of the situation. The sight of heavily armed soldiers, the roar of military vehicles, and the purposeful movements of the troops instilled a fear they had never experienced before. They watched as the military personnel focused their attention on a specific location near the town square, the very spot where they had last encountered Michael O'Connell. The realization hit them with the force of a physical blow. Could this overwhelming military response possibly be related to their interactions with the old man? The thought seemed preposterous, yet the converging evidence pointed to an undeniable connection. Michael O'Connell, now dressed in a crisp, well-maintained military uniform adorned with the insignia of his former rank, stepped out of a lead Humvee. He stood tall and resolute, his bearing commanding, his gaze sweeping across the assembled troops. The years seemed to have melted away, the quiet citizen replaced by the authoritative figure who once commanded the respect and loyalty of thousands. The sheer scale of the Army's arrival, the immediate and unquestioning response to his call, was a testament to the profound influence he still held. The bullying in the quiet streets of Havenwood was about to come to an abrupt and decisive end. The sight of Michael O'Connell stepping out of the lead Humvee, no longer the unassuming elderly resident, but a figure of commanding presence in his meticulously pressed uniform, sent a visible ripple of shock through the small group of Havenwood police officers. Sheriff Brody, who had approached with a mixture of confusion and a growing sense of dread, stopped dead in his tracks, his mouth slightly agape. Officers Miller and Davies, still frozen by the sheer scale of the military arrival, looked as though they had seen a ghost. O'Connell moved with a deliberate, unhurried gait, his gaze sweeping over the assembled troops, a silent acknowledgement of their swift and unwavering response. He then turned his attention to the stunned group of local law enforcement officials. His blue eyes, now sharp and piercing, locked onto Sheriff Brody. "Sheriff," O'Connell said, his voice calm and steady, yet carrying an undeniable weight of authority that resonated through the sudden silence of the town square. "I believe we have some matters to discuss." Brody, still trying to process the extraordinary scene unfolding before him, could only manage a stammered reply. "Sergeant Major O'Connell, we don't understand what's going on here." O'Connell's gaze shifted to Miller and Davies, who stood rigid and pale, their earlier arrogance completely vanished, replaced by a palpable fear. "These officers paid me a visit a few days ago," O'Connell stated, his tone even but with an underlying edge of steel. "And again today, their conduct was less than professional." Miller and Davies remained silent, their eyes darting nervously between O'Connell and the rows of heavily armed soldiers surrounding them. The stark contrast between their previous interactions with the elderly man and his current commanding presence was overwhelming. "Sheriff," O'Connell continued, his attention returning to Brody, "I expect a certain level of respect within this community. Respect for its citizens, and respect for those who have served to protect the freedoms we all enjoy." His words, though measured, carried an implicit condemnation of the officer's behavior. Brody, finally regaining some semblance of his authority, stepped forward slightly. "Sergeant Major, whatever happened, I assure you we will look into it. We were not informed of any situation requiring this level of response." He gestured towards the assembled military force, his voice tinged with a mixture of apprehension and a hint of defensiveness. O'Connell simply raised an eyebrow, a subtle gesture that conveyed volumes. "Sheriff, I believe the response is proportionate to the disrespect shown. These officers chose to bully a citizen of this town, a citizen who also happens to be a retired sergeant major of the United States Army. That is not something I take lightly." He turned his gaze back to Miller and Davies, who were now visibly trembling. "Officers," O'Connell said, his voice now carrying a distinct command tone, "I suggest you stand at attention when addressing a superior officer." Miller and Davies, as if compelled by an invisible force, snapped to attention, their eyes fixed straight ahead, their faces drained of color. The years of military training that O'Connell had instilled in countless young men seemed to momentarily override their civilian authority. O'Connell then turned back to Brody, his expression softening slightly. "Sheriff, I have brought my own means of ensuring that this situation is handled appropriately. I trust that you will cooperate fully." The implication was clear. O'Connell was now in charge, and the local police force was expected to follow his lead. The quiet citizen had returned, but he had brought an army with him. The power dynamics in Havenwood had shifted dramatically in the span of 30 minutes. Sheriff Brody, visibly shaken by the sudden and overwhelming military presence in Havenwood, found himself in an unprecedented and deeply uncomfortable position. The clear authority emanating from Sergeant Major O'Connell, now standing tall in his uniform, surrounded by armed troops, left no room for argument or defiance. Brody knew that any attempt to assert his own authority in this situation would be futile, potentially even dangerous. "Sergeant Major," Brody began, his voice still slightly trembling, Of course, we will cooperate fully. I had no idea about any of this." He gestured vaguely towards Officers Miller and Davies, who remained frozen at attention, their faces pale and drawn. O'Connell's gaze remained fixed on Brody, his expression serious and unwavering. "Sheriff, these officers acted inappropriately and with a distinct lack of respect towards a citizen of this town. That citizen also happens to be a veteran who served this nation with distinction for over 3 decades. Their behavior reflects poorly on your department and on the community as a whole." Brody nodded quickly, his mind racing to understand the full implications of this extraordinary event. "I understand, Sergeant Major. We will launch an immediate internal investigation into their conduct. They will be held accountable for their actions, I assure you." O'Connell's expression softened slightly. "I appreciate that, Sheriff. However, given the circumstances, I believe a more immediate course of action is warranted." He turned his attention to a colonel standing nearby, a high-ranking officer who had arrived with the main body of troops. "Colonel Davies, if you would." The colonel stepped forward, his bearing crisp and professional. "Sheriff Brody, by the authority vested in me, I am temporarily taking custody of Officers Miller and Davies. They will be escorted to the military installation for questioning regarding their conduct." Brody's eyes widened in surprise. "Custody?" "Sergeant Major, with all due respect, they are local police officers. We have our own procedures." O'Connell held up a hand, silencing Brody's protest. "Sheriff, I understand your concerns. However, I believe this is the most efficient and effective way to ensure a thorough and impartial inquiry. These officers showed a blatant disregard for military personnel, and it is only fitting that the military handles the initial stages of this investigation. His tone left no room for debate. Colonel Davies then addressed Officers Miller and Davies directly, his voice firm and authoritative. Officers, you are to consider yourselves under military escort. You will comply with all instructions given to you. Any resistance will be met with appropriate force. Do you understand? Miller and Davies, their faces now etched with fear, could only nod in silent acknowledgement, their eyes darting nervously towards the rows of armed soldiers surrounding them. The reality of their situation, the sheer power they now faced, seemed to finally be sinking in. Two uniformed military police officers stepped forward, their movements swift and precise. They approached Miller and Davies, and with calm but firm direction, escorted them towards a waiting military vehicle. The two local police officers, who just hours before had been wielding their authority with a degree of arrogance, now walked with a stunned and defeated demeanor, the weight of their actions finally upon them. O'Connell turned back to Sheriff Brody, his expression now more conciliatory. Sheriff, I have no desire to interfere with your local law enforcement. My intention here is simply to ensure that the disrespect shown to a veteran and a citizen of this community is addressed appropriately. After the initial questioning, we will share our findings with your department, and you can proceed with your own internal review. Brody, though clearly still reeling from the extraordinary events, nodded in reluctant agreement. He understood that he had little choice in the matter. The overwhelming power of the military presence made any opposition unthinkable. I understand, Sergeant Major. Thank you for handling this in a timely manner. O'Connell offered a curt nod. Accountability is essential, Sheriff, for all of us. His words hung in the air, a clear reminder of the standards of conduct he expected, both from his own military personnel and from those entrusted with upholding the law in his community. The streets of Havenwood, once a scene of quiet afternoon life, had now become a stage for a stark display of military authority and the swift consequences of disrespecting those who have served. The extraordinary events that unfolded in Havenwood in the span of a mere 30 minutes left the small town reeling, its peaceful facade shattered by the sudden and overwhelming presence of the United States Army. As the military police escorted Officers Miller and Davies away from the town square, a palpable tension settled over the community, a mixture of shock, awe, and a growing division of opinion regarding the unfolding situation. News of the Army's arrival spread through Havenwood like wildfire, fueled by frantic phone calls and bewildered social media posts. Residents who had been enjoying a quiet afternoon were drawn to their windows and porches, their faces etched with disbelief as they witnessed the long convoy of military vehicles parked around the town square. The sight of uniformed soldiers standing jing-jie-di on street corners, their weapons visible, was a stark contrast to the familiar tranquility of their town. At the local diner, the usual friendly banter was replaced by hushed and anxious conversations. Some patrons expressed their support for Michael O'Connell, viewing the military's intervention as a justified response to the disrespectful and potentially abusive behavior of the local police officers. They spoke of O'Connell's quiet dignity and his years of service, arguing that he deserved respect and that the Army's swift action was a powerful statement against the mistreatment of veterans. Others, however, voiced concerns about the unprecedented involvement of the military in what they considered a local law enforcement matter. They worried about the implications of such a show of force in a civilian community, and questioned whether Sergeant Major O'Connell had overstepped his bounds by summoning the Army. Some felt that while the police officer's behavior might have been inappropriate, it should have been handled through internal police procedures and the local justice system, not by a military intervention. The division was evident in the conversations overheard on the streets and in the tense exchanges on local social media groups. Longtime neighbors found themselves on opposing sides of the issue, their opinions colored by their personal experiences with the local police and their views on the role of the military in society. Some residents, who had previously had negative encounters with Officers Miller and Davies, openly cheered the Army's arrival, while others, who were friends or family members of the officers, expressed anger and disbelief at the military's actions. Sheriff Brody found himself caught in the middle of this growing divide. While he understood the concerns of the residents who were troubled by the military presence, he also recognized the validity of the outrage directed at Miller and Davies. He had received numerous phone calls from town officials and concerned citizens, all demanding answers about the extraordinary events unfolding in Havenwood. Brody himself was still trying to process the situation, feeling a sense of helplessness as his authority seemed to be superseded by the military. Meanwhile, the military personnel maintained a professional and disciplined presence, their interactions with the local residents polite but brief. They followed their orders with precision, securing the area around the town square and maintaining a watchful eye on the unfolding situation. Sergeant Major O'Connell remained a visible but largely silent figure, observing the scene with a resolute expression, the weight of his decision and the community's reaction clearly on his mind. Havenwood, a town that prided itself on its peaceful harmony, was now grappling with a deep and potentially long-lasting division. The unexpected arrival of the Army having exposed underlying tensions and differing perspectives within the community. The extraordinary events in Havenwood, initially confined to the bewildered residents of a small town, quickly transcended local boundaries, escalating into a national conversation that ignited passionate debates across the country. The image of a significant military force descending upon a peaceful American town in response to the alleged bullying of an elderly veteran by local police officers was a powerful and unsettling one, capturing the attention of news outlets and social media platforms nationwide. Initial reports were fragmented and often sensationalized, leading to a flurry of speculation and misinformation. However, as more details emerged, the distinguished military career of Sergeant Major, retired, Michael O'Connell, the accusations of harassment and disrespect by Officers Miller and Davies, and the sheer scale and speed of the military response, the narrative began to solidify, sparking a wave of intense public reaction. News channels ran continuous coverage, featuring interviews with Havenwood residents, legal experts, and retired military personnel. The incident became a focal point for discussions about police conduct and accountability, particularly in smaller communities where oversight might be less rigorous. Many commentators expressed outrage at the alleged mistreatment of a decorated veteran, highlighting the importance of respecting those who had dedicated their lives to serving the nation. Veterans organizations across the country released statements expressing their solidarity with Sergeant Major O'Connell and condemning the disrespectful behavior reportedly exhibited by the Havenwood police officers. The hashtag #StandWithSergeant Major began trending on social media, with countless individuals sharing stories of their own experiences with law enforcement or expressing their support for O'Connell and the military's actions. However, the military intervention also drew considerable criticism. Civil liberties advocates and legal scholars raised concerns about the appropriateness of using military force in a domestic law enforcement situation. They argued that while the police officer's behavior might have been reprehensible, the response should have been handled through civilian channels, raising questions about the precedent set by Sergeant Major O'Connell's actions. The debate extended to the role of veterans in society and the level of deference they are owed. While there was widespread agreement that veterans should be treated with respect and gratitude, some questioned whether their past service justified bypassing civilian law enforcement procedures. The incident forced a national reckoning with the complex relationship between the military, law enforcement, and the citizenry, political commentators weighed in from all sides of the spectrum, using the Havenwood incident to support their existing narratives about law enforcement, military spending, and the state of American society. The story became a lightning rod for broader cultural anxieties and political divisions, turning a seemingly isolated local event into a symbol of larger national issues. Even within Havenwood, the national attention amplified the existing divisions. While some residents felt vindicated by the widespread condemnation of the police officers' actions, others felt increasingly uncomfortable with the intense scrutiny their small town was now under. The presence of news crews and protesters added to the sense of unease, disrupting the quiet rhythm of life that they had long cherished. Sheriff Brody found himself under immense pressure, fielding calls from state officials, news reporters, and concerned citizens, all demanding answers and accountability. The once unassuming town of Havenwood had become the epicenter of a national debate, its name now synonymous with the complex and often contentious issues surrounding law enforcement, military authority, and the treatment of veterans in America. The intense national spotlight that had descended upon Havenwood began to dim as the immediate crisis subsided and the initial shock gave way to a more measured assessment of the events. The military investigation into the conduct of Officers Miller and Davies proceeded swiftly and thoroughly. While the specifics of their questioning remained confidential, the overwhelming evidence of their disrespectful and bullying behavior towards Sergeant Major O'Connell was undeniable. Sheriff Brody, under immense pressure from both the local community and state authorities, announced the temporary suspension of both officers pending the outcome of the military inquiry and the internal police department review. The decision was met with a mixed reaction in Havenwood, some feeling it was a necessary step towards accountability, while others viewed it as bowing to undue military pressure. Sergeant Major O'Connell, having made his point and ensured that the issue was being taken seriously, began to oversee the withdrawal of the military forces from Havenwood. The massive convoy of vehicles that had so suddenly appeared on the town's streets began to dissipate, the soldiers returning to their base with the same efficiency and precision they had displayed upon arrival. The departure was a much quieter affair than the arrival. There were no flashing lights or blaring sirens, just the steady rumble of engines as the military vehicles rolled out of town in an orderly procession. The residents of Havenwood watched in silence, a sense of lingering disbelief still hanging in the air. The extraordinary event had left an indelible mark on their community, a stark reminder of the power dynamics that could unexpectedly surface in their quiet corner of the world. O'Connell, dressed once again in his civilian attire, stood on his porch, watching the last of the military vehicles disappear down Sycamore Lane. He felt a sense of quiet satisfaction that the disrespect he had endured had been addressed, that the young officers had been made to understand the gravity of their actions. However, there was also a weariness in his eyes, a sense of the effort it had taken to bring about this resolution. He had not sought to cause a national spectacle, but the circumstances had necessitated a response that went beyond local intervention. Later that day, Colonel Davies visited O'Connell at his home. The colonel, a man who had served under O'Connell years ago, expressed his personal respect and conveyed the general's gratitude for O'Connell's decisive action. He informed O'Connell that the military had shared its preliminary findings with the Havenwood Police Department and that the evidence strongly supported O'Connell's account of the events. O'Connell simply nodded, his focus on the roses he was once again tending. They needed to learn a lesson, Colonel. Respect is earned, and it is owed to everyone, regardless of their age or background, especially those who have served this country. Colonel Davies agreed wholeheartedly. Your actions, Sergeant Major, have sent a powerful message that will resonate far beyond Havenwood. The General has already issued a reminder to all units about the importance of respecting civilian authority and the community we serve, but equally, the expectation of respect for our veterans. After a brief conversation, The colonel saluted O'Connell and departed, leaving the retired sergeant major to the quiet solitude of his home and his garden. The national news coverage gradually shifted to other events, but the story of Havenwood and the old soldier who summoned an army continued to be discussed in online forums and local conversations. Life in Havenwood slowly began to return to its familiar rhythm, but things were subtly different. The town was more aware of its local police force, and the interactions between law enforcement and the community seemed to carry a newfound sense of caution and mutual respect. Officers Miller and Davies remained suspended, their futures with the Havenwood Police Department uncertain. Michael O'Connell returned to his quiet routine, his morning walks to the diner, his afternoons spent reading on the porch swing or tending his roses. To the casual observer, he was once again just another elderly gentleman enjoying his retirement. But those who knew even a part of the story now looked at him with a different kind of respect, a silent acknowledgement of the quiet strength and the unwavering pride of the old soldier who had, with a single phone call, brought an army to their town. The impact of his actions, though the military had quietly departed, lingered in the air of Havenwood like the scent of late-blooming roses. The dust settled in Havenwood, both literally and figuratively, long after the last military vehicle had rumbled out of town. The extraordinary events of that late autumn afternoon had left an indelible mark, a quiet yet profound alteration to the fabric of the community. The national media eventually moved on to other headlines, but the story of the old soldier and the army he commanded continued to be whispered in local coffee shops and debated in town hall meetings. The Havenwood Police Department underwent a period of intense scrutiny. The internal review, coupled with the findings from the military investigation, led to the eventual dismissal of Officers Miller and Davies. Their behavior, once seemingly tolerated as the overzealousness of youth, was now viewed with a newfound seriousness, a stark reminder of the potential for abuse of power, even in a small town. Sheriff Brody, though initially caught off guard by the military intervention, took the opportunity to implement stricter training protocols for his officers, emphasizing respect for all citizens, particularly veterans and the elderly. A noticeable shift occurred in the demeanor of the local police force, a greater sense of humility and a more pronounced commitment to community service. The relationship between the town of Havenwood and the nearby military installation underwent a subtle but significant evolution. While there had always been a degree of respect for the armed forces, the events surrounding Sergeant Major O'Connell fostered a deeper connection. The residents witnessed firsthand the unwavering loyalty and immediate response of the military, reinforcing the profound bond between those who serve and the nation they protect. Community events began to feature a more prominent military presence, and local schools organized visits from veterans, sharing their stories and fostering a greater understanding of their service. Michael O'Connell continued his quiet life on Sycamore Lane. He became something of a local legend, though he never sought the attention. People would often offer him a nod of respect, a silent acknowledgement of the extraordinary authority he had wielded with such quiet determination. He remained unassuming, tending his roses and enjoying the peaceful rhythm of his days. But there was a newfound sense of quiet pride in his bearing. He had stood up for himself, not through anger or aggression, but through a quiet assertion of his dignity and the unspoken power of his past service. The themes of respect, authority, and justice resonated throughout Havenwood in the years that followed. The incident served as a catalyst for broader conversations about the responsibilities that come with authority, whether it be in law enforcement or the military. It highlighted the importance of treating every individual with dignity and the potential consequences of disrespect, regardless of age or perceived social standing. The swift and decisive response of the Army served as a powerful reminder that, even in a seemingly ordinary town, extraordinary forces could be summoned when fundamental principles were violated. Life in Havenwood eventually settled back into a semblance of its former tranquility. But the memory of the day the army arrived remained a potent reminder of the town's unexpected brush with national attention and the quiet strength of the old soldier who had, with a single phone call, brought about profound and lasting change. The roses in Michael O'Connell's garden continued to bloom each year, a vibrant testament to the enduring power of respect and the quiet dignity of a man who had served his country and, in the end, reminded his community of the true meaning of those values.